Who you know is much more important than what you know when it comes to elite networks. Research has found that the US Securities and Exchange Commission, the stock market regulator, is less likely to prosecute politically connected firms. And even if they do, such firms typically face lower fines. Particularly helpful are donations given to politicians who sit on SEC oversight committees, or those in executive government. In other words, it's okay to cheat if you're politically connected. Just recall the example of Bernie Madoff I mentioned in the other video. When the SEC was investigating the allegations against him, all he had to do was to call his friend, who was the chairperson of the SEC, and she ended the investigation. Nowhere is the tie to politics stronger than in the finance industry. Network theory research has found that only 147 firms, 3/4 of which are financial institutions, hold 40% of ownership control over all other international corporations. At the helm of such super entities are financial sector CEO superhubs, typically the most connected nodes in the corporate world, as I've shown you in the other video. And they maintain strong friendship links with politicians in power. The best example here is the revolving door between finance and politics. What starts with cultural capture or regulatory capture, where regulators start adopting the same point of view, the same culture of the industry they regulate, turns into direct exchange of employment positions between the corporate, regulatory, and political world. In one of the previous videos, I also mentioned the examples of Bob Rubin and Tim Geithner, but there's so much more. Chiefs of staffs of the president or member of his economic council end up as corporate CEOs or board members on Wall Street. Congressmen and MPs take on board positions of companies they used to oversee. Central bank governors cash in on their experience on Wall Street or in London City, or even the reverse, like Goldman Sachs former executives becoming prime ministers in Australia, Italy, Greece, etc. Again, none of this is illegal or illegitimate. It's not even unethical. It makes sense to hire people with deep industry experience to a delicate task such as the Treasury Secretary or Central Bank Governor. And it also makes sense that these individuals want to cash in on their vast knowledge and experience, which they gain from being in a position of power. After all, which firm wouldn't want to hire a superhub with all the powerful connections as their advisor or on their board? The problem with this practice, which can never be forbidden or broken up, is that former, or in this case future, top industry executives are highly unlikely to significantly constrain the power of these industry giants. Nor are they necessarily in the best position to recognize the difference between what is in the public interest and what is in the private interest. They are necessarily biased simply due to the proximity of the people they have to regulate. Consider the allocation of TARP funds. So that's the bailouts during the panic of September and October of 2008 in the US banking industry. During the worst days of the panic, regular daily formal and informal meetings were held between the CEOs of the 8 biggest banks in the country and the New York Fed Chair Tim Geithner and US Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson. This was all well documented at the time, and what we saw from this was the extent of these deep personal connections. In times of crisis, bank CEOs use their personal connections to help save their companies and, by extension, the financial system. But the bailout allocation process was done by design between friends in positions of power. On that, I actually wrote a paper that got published in Public Choice. It was my second PhD paper. And I showed that politically connected firms had a clear advantage in the bailout allocation when compared to politically unconnected firms. I looked at very close elections of congressmen in the 2008 elections, very close because chance tends to play a big role between winners and losers, and how these close races determined whether banks that were connected to the winning congressman got a better bailout deal than the banks that were connected to the losing congressman. Remember, they lost by a small margin. What I found was that a close victory of a connected politician increased the share of bailouts to total assets for that bank by about 20%. Also, firms with more connected politicians winning close elections receive about 12% more bailout funds compared to total assets for each connected politicians. Or to put this in perspective, if a bank donated to 7 more politicians, which is a 1 standard deviation increase, who would win a close election, it would get 47% more bailout funds. So the more politicians you had in your network, the better the bailout deal, controlling for all other things, obviously. This doesn't imply that the decision makers broke the law, okay, or explicitly gave more funds to the banks they were connected to. But it does suggest that it paid off to be a part of a congressman's social network during turbulent times of the financial crisis. Such relationships represent a spontaneous survival instincts, and this determines how elite network members react in preserving their privilege or positions of power, an instinct that's particularly strong during episodes of widespread panic. As I say in the paper, it generally pays off for firms to be connected to politics, but at times of crisis, it pays off even more. Both empirical research and investigative journalism keep showing us exactly this. Recall what the New York Times uncovered in the UK during COVID, and how the British government allocated procurements of COVID tests and various protective equipment and ventilators to firms that were close to the governing Conservative Party. Define close. Well, firms that employed former Conservative ministers or gave the biggest party donations to the party got the better deal. When a quick decision needs to be made, procedures are bypassed, politicians act on discretion, and those with proximity to power benefit the most.